Hello, welcome again to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today we will be introducing a new feature, and I'm sorry if we're a little late, but we're having to work on some technical matters here. But by doing a live stream, you'll have an opportunity to communicate directly with Mrs. LaRouche with your questions and ideas that can enable you to be an active part of the discussion. So if you have a question or an idea to share with Helga, you can send it to us at the questions@schillerinstitute.org, or you can list them in the chat room where Anastasia is standing by. So Helga, let's start with you. There have been a lot of important developments. Why don't you begin with your overview of what you see as the most important of these?
Well, I greet all of you and welcome you and invite you to ask as many questions as you want to do. Let me just highlight a couple of things which I think are really the decisive changes in the situation. Now, this morning, naturally, the big story was in the New York Times that, all of a sudden the culprits of the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage have been found, supposedly a pro-Ukrainian group which rented a yacht and then did it with 6 people, two divers, two assistant divers, a captain and a female doctor, and supposedly they did that all by themselves. Now, if you remember, when the actual sabotage occurred, there was a lot of discussion about how that part of the Baltic Sea is the most controlled, most surveyed, that it was completely impossible for the Russians to get there in a secret way without being notified. Now, that makes this belated story already very questionable. But then this morning in Germany, all of a sudden, several journalists outed themselves from the first channel TV in Germany, the Southwest Radio, and Die Zeit magazine. Supposedly, they have been investigating for a long time the research, the investigation of the general attorney investigating that. And they found that, this yacht supposedly went from the seaport of Rostock, that it was basically rented by a firm sitting with its headquarters in Poland, but owned by 2 Ukrainians. Now, this is all extremely ominous because, Seymour Hersh revealed his investigation beginning of February. And this has caused waves internationally. The story is not getting under the rug again because it just does not make any sense. Seymour Hersh was many times on international media, including Chinese TV. Ray McGovern was on CGTN. It was picked up around the world. And if, that put an enormous pressure on Biden because, the story was always, that Biden was in a press conference, pressure on Scholz, because Scholz was in a press conference with President Biden on February 7th, 22, where Biden made this famous announcement that if the Russians would invade in Ukraine, then they would find ways to ending the pipeline. And then when a reporter asked Scholz, who was standing beside him, what does this mean? What are you saying, given the fact that this is a German pipeline built by Russia? Biden said, Scholz said with a sheepish smile, we are doing everything together, and this together, So that has raised the question, did they blow up the pipeline together? And, obviously, then a few days ago, a bit more than a week ago, Scholz went in a very unusual visit to the United States without entourage, without press corps. He had a 1 hour closed door meeting with Biden under 4 eyes. And, basically, supposedly this was all very secret and nothing was revealed. And then just a few days later, they come back with this story. Now, I think this is putting the likelihood that this is a CIA story, that this is a damage control, but very poorly. And I think Seymour Hersh, in an interview with CGTN, actually quite fittingly quoted Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter, which is this short story where the police can find a stolen letter by searching the apartment, and the letter is actually openly in a frame hanging at the wall. But since people, these police can't think out of the box, they don't get it. And I think this is a similar thing, because Hirsch said, well, how comes that this is such a big story and President Biden is so powerful? Why did he not just order his intelligence community to investigate this whole affair and find the culprits, which supposedly naturally are the Russians? A very strange affair. And I think it definitely is increasing the pressure to have an international investigation, which must include Russia, because, otherwise this will not go away. If it stays like that, I think the cover-up may turn out to be more devastating than the actual crime. So I want to leave it at that, and maybe you have some more questions pertaining to that. But I think this is not going away, and I think if it's not clarified, it is tremendously erosive for the future of NATO, because if it turns out that it was the United States in collaboration with Norway, as Hirsch says, well, what do you need enemies for if you have friends like that? What does it mean for Germany? Germany has already egg on its face, at least the government, because, people are saying, what's wrong with the German government that they let themselves be treated this way? The German economy, in the meantime, is having incredible difficulties. We are facing a deindustrialization, and the energy prices are a very large part of it. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing, which I think is really very important, the situation with the Ukraine war is getting more dangerous by the day. And there are more and more experts who are warning that if not a solution is found, this may escalate into World War III. And, the fact that people like Victoria Nuland, of fame from the 2014 Maidan coup, we should not forget her role in that. She is egging the Ukrainians on and say, if you want to take Crimea, that's fine. We are totally behind it. Now that is a red line, and for Russia. And the situation basically is extremely dangerous. The military situation on the ground is a grinding up of the Ukrainian population. And as of now, it is very difficult to see who can win militarily, because, Russia cannot afford to lose. Ukraine will definitely not win. Russia cannot lose because they are a nuclear power. So the recent proposal by the Chinese, who made a 12-point program, a peace proposal, including such demands as respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and many other proposals, which all make a lot of sense. This proposal was appreciated by a lot of people in the global south. The Chinese proposal is welcomed by Russia as a starting point of discussion. It was immediately rejected by Biden, who said it's irrational. It's rejected by the EU Commission. And the question is, why would there not be an effort on the side of the West to end a war which can only be at the absolute sacrifice of the Ukrainian people? Now, I was thinking about it and writing an article last week. I thought, why is it that the West is not responding to any reasonable proposal? The Pope has made another one, which we are backing and organizing for. Why are they not doing that? And I was rereading a lot of old reports and so forth, and I came across again what we had published at the time, but in the present light gains a new importance. And that is that since quite some time, actually one can go back to Brzezinski and his plans for Russia, but in the recent period, there were a whole bunch of discussions, among others from the so-called US Helsinki Committee in the Congress, proposing a so-called decolonization of Russia, meaning that Russia should not continue to exist as one coherent state, the Russian Federation, but it should be cut into many states, maybe 10 states. And there were a whole bunch of other conferences, international conferences in Gdansk, in Poland, in Warsaw, in Prague. And just as recently as December, there was a conference in Washington organized by the Jamestown Foundation and the Hudson Institute, which had the same subject, basically saying that Russia should be split up into many different states. And in June last year, Lech Wałęsa, former president of Poland, also said that Russia should be cut down to only be 50 million people instead of 144 million as it is now, and it should be cut into different states. Now, one has to keep that in mind because, when you only look at day-to-day politics, people sometimes forget, these long arcs of history. And Putin and Lavrov and some other Russian officials in the meantime have always said that the aim is to dismantle Russia. And that was always pushed aside as paranoid or just propaganda and so forth. But now if you think about it, that has been on the table. And that is why, one of the reasons why Putin in December 22 demanded legally binding security guarantees that Ukraine would not join NATO, that offensive weapon systems would not be put at the border of Russia. And he demanded an answer from the US and NATO, and there came really no answer to the core questions, only some offers of arms negotiation, but not really answering to that. Now it turns out, at least that's what Seymour Hersh said, that the preparations for Nord Stream 2 sabotage, or both Nord Stream pipelines, started 9 months earlier. Now, if you go from June 9 months back, that puts it somewhere in 22, long before Putin demanded these security guarantees, and long before, for sure, what is always termed to be an unprovoked aggression by Russia. So the whole story is obviously much, much more complicated, and you can be sure that Russian intelligence would absolutely be aware of such discussions and conferences and maybe who knows what else to dismantle Russia. And that is why Russia, Putin several times, and Shoigu and Lavrov said under what conditions Russia would use nuclear weapons, namely when the existence of Russia would be at stake. Now, all of that is naturally always ironed out of the narrative in the media, and therefore I think it's very important that we take a fresh look at this whole thing, that we look back at the chronology of what actually happened. These conferences, Jamestown conference, US Helsinki conference, these are in the public domain. So this is not something which, is a matter of opinion, but everybody can look and check it. Now, I think this is very important because there is another development which I only can touch upon here, and we can deepen it later. And that is the fact that, what is occurring right now is indeed a tectonic shift in the strategic realignment. That basically, in response to all of this, the global south, which by now is the global majority, it's the vast majority of countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, want to basically create a new system. And because of the weaponization of the dollar, the US confiscated 300 billion from Russia, 10 billion from Afghanistan, and whereas some from other countries, these countries are now de-dollarizing. They are creating their own currency. And, it's the majority of the human species. Apparently, 24 countries have applied memberships in the BRICS Plus. Now, the BRICS already before this happened had a higher GDP than the G7. So there is clearly a complete realignment. And, there are tremendous changes. For example, the recent two sessions conferences which are taking place in Beijing, there is a complete change in the Chinese tone. I think that they are openly now basically saying that the United States is trying to contain them, to prevent their rise, and that there is an effort to expand NATO into the Pacific. In any case, what I'm trying to say is that we are moving in a different alignment, and we have to have a discussion of how we get out of this. I have proposed, since the Ukraine war started in April, or it started in February, but we had conferences of the Schiller Institute since April, that we urgently need to have a new international security architecture and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on the planet. I have proposed 10 principles how such a new architecture could be organized. And I think that is extremely urgent, that we get an international discussion of, is the human species capable to avoid World War III, which this time would be nuclear and nobody would survive it? And can we give ourselves an order which allows the survival and well-being of all nations on this planet? And that is what I would like to encourage you, to discuss in this program and others to come, and in an upcoming new Schiller conference. So I want to stop at this point. I think there is some food for thought, and I'm very interested to hear your questions.
Well, Helga, there are a lot of questions, and I'll get to them in just a second. But if there are others who have questions, you can send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org. This is the weekly webcast with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and this is the first time we're trying live streaming. So if we can't get to all of your questions, which I can tell you now we're not going to, but keep them coming because we will answer them. Now, Helga, given what you just said in the introduction, there were 2 or 3 questions on the same basic topic, but I'll take the one from Dr. Schultze-Simon, who just said, how can we bring Russia and Ukraine together to negotiate as quickly as possible?
Well, I mean, given the fact that Ukraine is not really its own master, but it's really the US, the British, NATO, which are basically running this war since quite some time, long before actually the Russian intervention occurred last February. I think it needs, it needs pressure on NATO, on the US. And that is one of the reasons why we are supporting an offer by Pope Francis, who already has offered some months ago the venue of the Vatican as a neutral place where basically negotiations without preconditions can start. And I know that at this point, Russia doesn't want to do that because they say, why should we trust anybody in the West after even Merkel and Hollande, former president of France, admitted, and Poroshenko naturally, that they never meant the Minsk process serious, but they only engaged in it to gain time to arm and build up the military in Ukraine. So the Russians right now are not inclined to trust anybody in the West. The Ukrainians cannot really act because they're not their own actor. So I think the only way how we get this resolved is we have to have an international chorus of forces who say this leads to World War III if it's not stopped. Therefore, it's automatically a question of every person on the planet. That is why we need a world movement of world citizens. This is actually what the Schiller Institute has started to promote since last October. And we need voices to say, we demand that such negotiations take place to create an international environment. Now, if all the countries of the global south would basically say that, and they have expressed that view already by refusing to condemn the Russian invasion because they don't buy the story that that this was an unprovoked war. At the recent G20 finance ministry ministers meeting in India, the majority of these countries did not condemn Russia because they don't agree with this narrative. The beginning peace movement, the demonstration on the 19th of February in Washington, the 50,000 demonstration in Berlin, the very large demonstrations in France. Yesterday there were more than 1.5 million people out in the street, mostly against the pension reform, but also, a large part of that for peace. There are demonstrations in Italy. I think if all of these people, the peace demonstrations in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, and the countries of the global south would all join in and say, we demand that this war stops, we demand negotiations, the Ukrainian people are the victims, and we basically think that only if we move to a new paradigm of cooperation can this problem be solved. We can create an environment which will make it very difficult to keep this war going.
Okay, and Helga, here's a question for you from John Taylor, who starts by saying he applauds your 10-point program inspired by the Treaty of Westphalia, but he said that he thinks an 11th point is necessary because he thinks people in the West and the leadership are scared that they'll be prosecuted once the war ends and that they would be under attack because of their role in promoting the war. He asks, could there be an 11th point on your proposal that would be a point of forgiveness, absolution, or atonement?
Well, that is definitely worth considering. Obviously, there is a Nuremberg statute that if you prepare a war of aggression, then that represents a Nuremberg crime. So that is one consideration. But then if you look at the Peace of Westphalia, which ended 150 years of religious war in Europe, because everybody realized that there would be nobody left if the war would continue, they came up with principles, and one of the major principles, apart from that any peace proposal has to take into account the interest of the other, was the idea that for the sake of peace, the crimes of the one side or the other have to be forgiven. And I think that not only applies for war crimes on the one side or the other, but one could possibly consider what you are saying. But I don't want to answer that question so lightly because I have to give it some deep thoughts. But there are these two options, the Nuremberg Tribunal and the Peace of Westphalia approach. And I promise you, I will give it some more thoughts and open it also for discussion among other people.
Okay, if you just joined us, this is a dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. It's a live stream, so I've got to move the questions somewhat quickly. But if you have questions, send them to questions@schillerinstitute.org. Here's a question for you, Helga. What is the attitude of the people of Germany toward the push for heavy sanctions against China and the anti-China policy?
Well, it's very complicated because, there is right now a divide, for example, between East and West, where many people in East Germany, because of the history of the GDR, for example, do absolutely not buy the demonization of Russia. People in West Germany are more influenced by the Western media. Concerning China, it is more complicated because I think until there was a shift in the attitude by the security papers in the United States and other NATO countries starting about 2017, 2018, the general picture of people of China was much, much, much more positive. And the initial discussion of the new Silk Road, what became known as the Belt and Road Initiative, was actually very enthusiastic. But then when you had a permanent bombardment by the mass media, starting to portray China as autocratic and dictatorship and all of this, which, is really absolutely not true. This obviously will not be accepted by many people, but I can tell you, I have been in China many times, starting in 71, and the trajectory of development in China is that most people in the West would only dream about. They have performed an economic miracle, lifting 850 million people out of poverty, and then offering that Chinese miracle model in the Belt and Road Initiative form to developing countries who started to, see for the first time the chance to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. So, the Chinese model is something one should study. And if you do that, you find that the economic model, especially concerning the financial system, is much closer to the American system of economy of Alexander Hamilton than, let's say, the present City of London or Wall Street model. So, I think that the people of Germany are not really united. The people who have knowledge of China, who have traveled there, who have done business, who are married with a Chinese, all of these people have an extremely positive image of China. And, I know of many such people. But naturally, if you only listen to the mainstream media, then and you get it every day and so forth, then, it's much more harder. So I think it's not decided at all. But I think the German people, there is underneath, I would say maybe half of the people are still sleeping, but there is a growing revolt of people who really realize, hey, wait a second, this whole thing does not function, and the present policies do not represent the self-interest of the German people. And I think that that will become stronger and stronger, especially if you also help us to mobilize people.
Okay, Helga, here's a question from Matthew in Dublin, Ireland. He says, as an EU citizen, why is the main country in our union, referring to the United Kingdom, Great Britain, so obsessed with maintaining US hegemony rather than cooperation and multipolarity?
Well, that's a good question. I think the only way how to explain it is if you understand the principle of oligarchy, because, up to the 15th century, all countries, at least in the Western, in Europe and beyond, were oligarchies, which means a system where you have a small oligarchical elite which organizes everything according to their privileges, and to keep the mass of the population as underdeveloped as possible, because that makes it easier to rule. Now, there have been new developments. The modern nation state developed. You had states which were devoted to the common good. But I would say that the British Empire, for example, which still exists, I think it's a big illusion to think that the British Empire has stopped. It continues to exist in a modern form. I would say that the financial institutions of the City of London, of Wall Street, they are what you would call the present British Empire, including its control in some of the Commonwealth countries. And I think that the elite of that empire, in the United States, I would say it's the mixture of Wall Street, the military-industrial complex, or what Ray McGovern calls the Mickey Met, the military intelligence, Congress, academia, think tank, I probably forgot some military-industrial complex. But the majority of the people, I think that they are normal people. And if I would not believe that the normal people are generally good, I would have given up hope a very long time ago. So I think right now we have to really get the normal people and those in the institutions who represent the interest of these people to help us to, mobilize the population before it is too late.
Helga, I think we're running short on time, but I have another question for you from Jack Gilroy, who's been working with us on the Rage Against the War Machine demonstration and other activities. And he writes that there's a need to engage Generation Z in the nonviolent fight against the dominant system of militarism. And he suggested using Earth Day this coming November to expose the merchants of death, the military, investment bankers, and so on, who are a threat to the planet. What do you think about this generational question and his idea?
Well, I know that you are also working with Pax Christi, and I think that's extremely important that we indeed, you know, that we get people to understand what are the laws of the universe, what is the actual, mission what man has, and you can discuss it in religious terms. That's why in the 10th of my 10 principles said that we have to assume or proceed from the assumption that man is good by nature. That has been the most controversial point. But if you look at all the great religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and some of the other religions or other philosophies, the good ones always proceed from the idea that man is fundamentally good and that all evil comes from a lack of development. Now, that is a very important entry point because, also concerning the earth, man is not just an animal. Man is fundamentally different from all other creatures because we have the gift of creative reason, which enables us to discover again and again universal principles of the creation of the physical universe. And that is why with modern science, we are now in a position more and more to attune, to bring into accordance our political, economic, and social life on Earth with the laws of creation. And I think that that is a tremendous challenge, but I think, in the past, we could only discuss it philosophically. In European history, it was called natural law, that there is a higher law than that given by man. But natural law, today, we have natural science. We can study what is this law given in the creation. And for example, when we develop thermonuclear fusion, we are imitating the fusion process on the sun. Now that is a law of the universe, so we can gain energy security for the entire human species once we get commercial fusion power, which is looking not so far away anymore given the recent breakthroughs we have been made. We are replicating something which is taking place as a natural process on the sun. And that's just one example what I mean by that we have to attune our activity on the planet with the laws of creation or the physical universe. I could give you many other examples where discoveries, what we make, for example, in space science or in space travel, new knowledge we gain from the James Webb telescope, for example, about the actual condition of our physical universe, which consists out of many, many trillions of galaxies. Now, I find this always the most mind-boggling idea. But with modern science, with the Hubble telescope, with the James Webb telescope, we can now actually look with scientific rigor how is our universe, and we can draw conclusions from that for our existence on the planet. So there's no reason to be pessimistic. I think if we get out of this present danger, which is an existential danger to all of humanity, but there's also, on the horizon, a new paradigm where if we make that shift, that we get all nations to cooperate rather than to go for confrontation, it's already visible that we are in the beginning of a new epoch of civilization, and that is a very joyful perspective.
Well, thank you for that answer, Helga. We're just about out of time, and maybe I'll just take the privilege of answering the final two questions. One person asked, can we have an international conference to organize around these principles? Well, we've been doing that. So watch the Schiller Institute webpage to see when our next event will be. And then someone asked, how about an international party around these principles? Join the Schiller Institute. Help us build this movement that Helga just described, that is the movement for a new paradigm. So, Helga, thanks for joining us today. You have any final words?
Yeah, I'm happy that there are more questions than we could answer. I will for sure try to incorporate them in my next live program next week. And if there are very urgent ones, we can also communicate in the meantime in a written form. So please keep this dialogue. I think it's very important to engage as many people as possible and become active with us.
So keep the questions coming in at questions@schillerinstitute.org. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week.
Till next week.